Okay, so we're almost done with Genesis 3:17 and 19. We're going to finish this off. We've been talking about the judgment on the serpent. We talked about the judgment on the woman. We've been talking about the judgment on the man. And now we're going to finish up the judgment against Adam here in the garden. Where we left off last week was we did not get to this phrase, until you return to the ground, since from it you were taken. We got to the point where he said, and you might not be able to see this on the screen because it shows up small enough, but it says, by the sweat of your face or brow you shall eat bread. You shall, and that's where we left off last week. We talked about the mental strain of day-to-day provision that man is going to feel as he has to go out, work the ground that will no longer naturally cooperate with his wishes. And it will produce the thorns and thistles, which is food you cannot eat. And in doing so, it's just going to be exponentially harder for man to make his day-to-day living. No results guaranteed. Until finally, you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So let's talk about this. Now, for rejecting God's gracious gift of rising above low and dirty origins to be kings and queens over his physical world, we will instead return to our lowly positions, dust, by means of physical death, a loss of authority in and over the physical world. This is what 3:19 is trying to tell us in a nutshell. The thing that the serpent will eat, dust, was our beginning. And now it is once again going to be our end. It never had to be, but we made our choice. You made your bed, now you have to sleep in it. Sort of thing going on here. We already kind of talked about this. It connects the painful toil and mental struggles as a lifelong rule for humans in our rebellious state, but you're always going to have the fear of loss and doubt, of inability and unsuccess hanging over you. Then in the end, a few years later, you'll die. You will actually lose. Out of all the fear of loss that life is going to weigh you down with, eventually you will lose. You will ultimately be, the breath of life will no longer be in you. That's the ultimate destiny. So all of the creation and success that we have in the end will go away. All because we refused God's way of life in the garden. And this is described as, you were dust, and to dust you will return. This is the climax of God's judgment on humanity. Everything since God said to the serpent, cursed are you above all livestock, everything has been heading towards this sentence here. Physical death will now be instituted in God's creation. This is a judgment that ultimately undoes creation. The creation of man in 2:17. Out of dust God formed a man, breathed into him the breath of life. That breath will not last forever, and ultimately they will return to dust. It was interesting because after Wednesday conversations, you and Shirley asked about cremation and being turned to ashes. And it really doesn't matter if in the end you're cremated or your body just decays one way or another. Your bones will eventually corrode and turn to dust. So trust me when I say God doesn't need to have a mummified corpse to resurrect you. He made us out of dust to begin with. We will return to dust, and then he can remake us in physical form. A couple of things to note on this. The word death isn't actually used here in 3:19. It was used in 2:7, where the phrase is, dying you will die, is a much more literal phrase. It gets translated, on the day that you eat of it, surely you will die. And they take this repetitive Hebrew wording, dying you will die, and make it say, surely you will die. So one of the questions is that we could ask of this is, when the serpent said, you're not going to die, and God said, on the day you eat of it, you'll die. Is that what he meant? On the day that you will eat of it? Because this phrase, dying you will die in 2:7, seems to mean something more along the lines of, the day that you eat of it, you'll start a process that will ultimately end in physical death. And now God is sealing that process as the end. So it doesn't have to be that God meant the day you eat the fruit, I'm going to smite you, and then they eat the fruit and God doesn't smite them. It could be something more along the lines of, the day that you eat of it, the day you rebel, you will begin a process, and that process will climax in physical death, which is the more poetic nature of what's being communicated throughout these chapters. And I think that's probably a stronger idea of what the author of Genesis is trying to say. So the wording here, return to dust, it's supposed to reflect back onto chapter 2's state of man before God breathed the breath of life into him. You're going back, you're going to return, O mankind, to your pre-life state of being, lifeless dust. That is going to be the consequences, aka physical death. Doesn't actually say physical death, but it means physical death. That's just the way poetic literature works in all languages. How can you say the thing without actually saying the thing? How few words can you use to say the most things in poetry? How can you avoid and circumvent saying something directly? An example of this, because you guys are reading Stormlight Archives, is that Kaladin deals with depression. And you'll see that very clearly at the start of Rhythm of War. But he just calls it the darkness. That's just a literary way of saying, how do you describe and portray depression without actually coming out and saying, yeah, this character struggles with depression. And you show, but you don't tell. Well, this is using words to tell and paint a picture to show without actually using the words. So in chapter 2, we've gone from God graciously bending down into the earth and like with his own hands forming man, standing over him, breathing breath into him. And now man is just utterly rebelled against God, and God says, fine, you will go back to being the dust I made you from. Now, this is where I was trying to get us to last week and end up right here. So it was only like 4 or 5 slides that we didn't get to last week. Before, I just wanted to move away from the discussion of the text in particular and just ask a couple of what I think are fairly interesting questions. So here's the first one. Was physical pain part of life in the garden before sin? What do you think? Before sin, was physical pain a normal part of life in the garden? Think about all that you know. He's got to plow, he's got to work, she's going to help him, they've got to farm. Was physical pain a reality before sin? Two, 2:7, what does yours say in 2:7? What does 2:17 mean? Maybe I wrote the wrong text up there and forgot a 1 or something. What is the verse that says? So that's 2:17. So I missed a 1 here. So look. Yeah, good. So I'm glad you brought that up. So I missed. Good. I missed a 1 here. So this is 2:17 says, "Dying, you will die." Nothing in chapter 3 actually uses the word death, but it portrays it. So thank you for pointing that out. So take your hard copies and write. See, this is why I don't like giving you hard copies of the notes until a week after. In case I make any mistakes tonight, I can go back, correct them, and then print them out. But write a big 1 next to that 7 so that you know it's 2:17, not 2:7. Okay, so was physical pain a part of life in the garden before sin? Let's assume that, for the sake of argument, because we're just thinking theoretically here, let's assume they've been there long enough that if pain existed, they could have experienced it. It doesn't really answer the question, Okay, that's one for yes. Anybody want to argue anything other than that? Okay, it certainly could be, because God, as I've mentioned before, wants them to leave the garden, expand the garden. They're going to have to go out into some of the more disordered lands, and maybe that would be a lot harder to plow than the provision in the garden, because they're close to God. The provision in the garden is, of course, exponentially there. So maybe it certainly could be that all they've done is just had to pick fruit right off the tree and not plowed. What if they fall out of the tree? Okay, gravity is still in effect in the garden, right? Okay. How can there be pain in childbirth if they don't already know what pain is? How would they understand that? That's a good point. Ultimately, we're not sure if physical pain was part of the life of the garden. Ultimately, however, my argument is going to be that very likely, yes, physical pain was present in God's created order. I think a part of, maybe they haven't gone out and plowed some new fields yet, but if they did, the natural response would be that they would, get blisters on their hands, their back would start getting sore, and they would feel physical pain. But number one, the results were always going to be worth it up until God has cursed the ground. I don't think the curse means now it's going to be painful for a start. I think it means it's now going to be much more painful and difficult to do it. And I think that language hints that God is not giving humanity necessarily an easy task, even if they're without sin. It's still going to be a big task. It's still going to be a lot of hard work. And understanding this is important because the tasks that Christians are given today by God are still tasks. They are still lots of hard work. They are still require effort, intention, and rest and healing. And I think that's more of the rhythms of the garden. The garden was a place where his abundant provision was always available as needed, meaning food, and that's kind of what Roger was saying, but also rest and relaxing, and also healing, not just in the daily provisions of food and water, but they have access to the tree of life. God hasn't told them they can't eat from that tree. It's right next, or it seems like in the description, it's right there next to the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's like all the trees that God could give them, the tree of life is the fruit that seems to have this description of, if you have pain or if you have healing or you cut yourself or you broke your leg or something, go eat from the tree of life, and it's very healing. Not just in the normal sense of rest and relaxing and just the natural flows of it. It seemed like the description of the tree of life is to say, here's the solution to your death problem. And this is going to come up again next week when they get exiled from the garden. They're not going to be able to reach out and take from the tree of life. And up until this point, they can. And it's the healing factor for their hurts and their pain available in the garden. And I'm issuing this to you next week, this question and this idea, give you some time to think about it, because next week, when they're exiled from the garden, what does it mean that they're going to be cut off from the tree of life? So I think there's a difference here. One, painful labor of working the ground, or theoretically of having children, but I say theoretically here because they haven't had any children yet. That's just where we're at in the story. Theoretically, whether they work the ground or have children, it would be worthwhile. The fruit of that labor was always a guaranteed positive. There were no thorns, there were no thistles, but was there pain? Yes. Would you gird your loins, stiff your back, and get to the hard work of gardening? Yes, because you knew God was going to bless your efforts. You knew that you could have rest and relaxation in God's presence in the garden and get a great night's sleep, maybe even wake up and eat some of the fruit, or eat the fruit and go to bed, wake up and eat the fruit, and be healed and ready to go for another day. The difference under judgment now is that the amount of pain is going to go up, And you could struggle and struggle and struggle, and you can still potentially come up empty in all the things that you're going to pursue. Even in all the good things that God is going to bless humanity as a whole with, He doesn't guarantee that you're going to get every one of those blessings. So, despite the painful toil of day-to-day or generation-to-generation survival, the results of all the labor and work are not going to be guaranteed. The thorns and thistles are now going to come up when you plant nothing but good seed. You can't eat these foods. They're produced on top of the food which you can eat that you were aiming to plant. And the farming process was always difficult. It's always been a lot of hard work to get crops, but previously guaranteed results are no longer so. So instead of planting 100 good seeds and reaping a crop of 1,000 plants and edible things coming out of the ground, all the work that He's going to put into planting and providing, you're still not going to be guaranteed that you're going to be able to feed your family. And the physical anguish that He's putting into this is His part of the judgment. And this is why it's both man and woman under judgment here. And while none of it is completely, because of course women can plant crops and experience the same things, it's not solely a judgment on man. It's just primarily one. But regardless of whatever our efforts are that we put into the process, whether it's reproduction, the production of people is not going to be guaranteed, or whether it's farming and the production of food is not going to be guaranteed. While we were in the garden, all that pain and effort and physical labor that we put in, and yes, experienced physical adversity in a hurt back and blistering fingers, was going to be worth it. Now it's not necessarily going to be worth it. God's full and complete provision through the difficult processes of farming crops, carrying and raising children, will no longer result in the guarantee that the goal you aim at will be achieved, regardless of any and all the efforts you could possibly put in it. So regardless of the results, you must choose to consciously follow God anyways, not go on rebelling. This is what the judgment is here to do. This is what the curse on the ground is here to do. This is what God's justice in making us face discipline is designed to do. Stop rebelling and come back to Him. But even if you come back to Him, don't come back to Him with the attitude of saying, I'm only coming back to you so that my life goes easier and more smooth. Because you can come back to God all you want. These judgments are still in effect. Coming back to God and stop rebelling is not a guarantee that things are going to go better for you. Because now you have to do both. You have to face life exiled from the garden, under the judgment, under the curse of the ground, under the presence of sin, and with a rebellious heart, have to learn to stop rebelling against God, just so that you trust God enough to let Him give you the blessings again, as if you're in Eden when you're not in Eden, until we get back to Eden when Jesus returns. One of the best episodes of television ever from Star Trek The Next Generation, one of the wisest things from Captain Jean-Luc Picard, it is possible to commit no mistakes and still lose. That is not weakness, that is life. And that is an invaluable lesson to learn, because this is exactly what the curse of Genesis 3 is designed to do as a whole. You can do everything right and you can still come up empty. That's not weakness. That's not a failure as a man. You haven't failed as a woman, you haven't failed as a man, you haven't failed as a person. It's just the realities that we're now going to live under. So we could do a lot worse than taking this to heart and saying, despite the fact that things may not go my way, I'm going to give my devotion and loyalty to doing things God's way, and not so that I can get results out of God and make things go the way that I want, but because I know and trust that His ways are best. And I will let Him bless, or like Job, I will let Him take away blessings as He wishes. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And sticking with that is ultimately the wisdom and maturity that I've been talking about on Sunday mornings since September. So my answers to the question, was there physical pain in life before the sin entered the world? Most likely yes. What has changed now is that, one, the pain is increased exponentially. There's with no cure at hand, so we can't just rest, relax, and be healed in the garden. The pain is increased. The results are no longer guaranteed. The mental challenges are exponentially intensified, largely because there's a lack of results. This will last as long as we live. You'll have seasons of plenty. You'll have seasons of famine. And then death will ultimately end all of our lives. Hooray. Because we've now taken God's perfectly ordered creation across days 1 through 6. We were the climax in day 6 here. And then God sat down and ruled on the 7th day. And we ripped the whole thing apart. This is just a visual explanation of saying God set it all up. We decided we could do better. We tore it all down. Now, we didn't really tear it all down, but it certainly feels that way as we go through life. Okay, a couple of other things that I want to mention from Adam's example. There is a biblical principle to be learned from this story of Adam, and it sets the stage for a lot of other prominent biblical figures. So I want us to get this straight from the beginning. The more revelation is given to someone, the more responsibility they have to obey it, and the stricter the consequences will be if they disobey it. You can see these if you do just character studies on the lives of Moses. This is a picture of Moses. He's on the mountain. He eats with God. He takes 70 elders up there. They all eat with God. And his face shines with the glory of God when he comes off the mountain. All he does in Numbers to disqualify him from entering the promised land is basically he does a couple of things. One, he's supposed to speak to this rock and tell it to give water. Instead, he strikes the rock, so that's one thing. But also, he treats God with a certain amount of disrespect because he says, look, we've been providing for you guys so much here. Why do you aggravate us? And then he gets upset, and that's why he strikes the rock instead of speaking to the rock. But God told him to speak to the rock, not to strike it. That's really all he did. But it was very disrespectful because he did it in front of all of Israel and basically said, God and I are taking care of you. And he makes himself out to be way higher in God's position than he actually is. So because of that, God says, that's it. You're not going into my promised land. You can stand on the mountain across it. You can look across the Jordan. You can see it, but you don't get to step foot in it. Moses was trying to, in a way, he was ascribing his own power to providing for Israel. And yeah, and God did not take that lightly, and Moses got to live out his days, but he did not get to step foot in the promised land. David, in 11 and 12, where he sleeps with Bathsheba, 24, where I think is where he counts the census of the armies, and basically tried to take military control for himself. When David sins, and David sins horribly, God many times. These are more the ones that he actively does, but there's all sorts of things that David should have done that he didn't do throughout his lifetime. And when he's putting Solomon on the throne, he says, also go take care of your uncle Joab, because that guy's terrible, and I haven't done anything about him for the last 40 years. So you do it. I mean, David is a great leader and a great political mind and a great heart, but the man is just totally screwed up, which I find very comforting. But you see that when David screws up, if you read the surrounding stories, not just his particular sins, God comes to him and he says, you got options here. I'm going to judge you. Pick your judgment, 1, 2, or 3. And David has to choose which of these harsh realities he's going to face. Because he was the king. God had been speaking through Samuel when he was a young man. He's now got the court prophet Nathan, who comes and communicates to him very directly. So when he screws up, he gets judged hard. He gets disciplined hard. There's a story in 1 Kings from just called the man from Judah, some random prophet who's told by God, go here, deliver this message, do not eat with them, do not stop and stay the night, deliver the message, turn around and go home the way that you came, do not stick around. But this other guy says, well, I'm a prophet of God too, and God said it's okay. And so the prophet says, well, I guess I'll stick around and eat. And then while they're eating, that prophet that lied to him says, God comes to that prophet and says, tell him he's going to die on his way home because he disobeyed me. Because it doesn't matter if you're a prophet of God and God tells you directly, this is what I want you to do, and then you listen to another human voice, it doesn't matter. And this is what James is summarizing when he says, not many of you should become teachers because you know that we who become teachers will incur a stricter judgment. James 3:1. He makes this point. And this is the reality for Adam. In the garden, Adam is the original king, priest, and prophet. He's the original ruler, human ruler of the world under God's authority. He's commissioned to serve and guard the garden in 2:15, which, as I described to you then, is priestly language. He's the original prophet because he communicates God's decree not to eat the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil to his wife. And then he turns around and he listens to his wife and eats the fruit that was forbidden. You can read a little bit on prophetic ideas in Ezekiel 3, and you could see how that would apply to Adam there, where in Ezekiel, God basically lays out, if a prophet does what I tell him to do, and he goes and he tells somebody what I said, that person doesn't obey, the prophet's okay and that person's not. But if the prophet decides he's not going to speak what I tell him to speak, you're both in trouble. And, he lays out the different options and categories there. Just as if you're given the responsibility of a priest, the Levites in the line of Aaron, which is why in Leviticus 9, Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, they have had everything laid out for them. They're consecrated as priests, and they turn around and they offer to the Lord unauthorized fire. They put fire in the altar that they're not supposed to do to burn up the offerings, and fire comes out from the altar and kills them. And God tells Moses to tell Aaron, you don't get to grieve for your sons. They got what they deserved. He's that strict because he's going to set it up in such a way where it says, if you're going to approach me, and I want you to approach me, you have to approach me with proper respect and fear. If you're going to turn around and do exactly the opposite of what I just told you not to do, you're not going to get to approach me anymore. It's the same thing of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. They lie to the Holy Spirit. They say, well, yeah, we sold the money. We sold the field. We made this much money, and we gave you all the money. Peter says, no, you didn't, and you can't lie to God. It was your money. You didn't have to give it, but you just lied about it, so you're going to die. And they died. And the picture is they knew what they were not supposed to do, and they deliberately did it anyways, which is no different than what's going on in the garden, especially with Adam, because he was the one that God said basically face-to-face, even more face-to-face than Moses, you can eat from any tree you want except for that one. Because when you eat from that one, the consequences are going to be really, really bad. So what does he do? He eats from the tree that he's not supposed to eat. And he gets himself in all of this anguish. Now, I'm pointing this out one last time. This is primary, not sole responsibility. Primary responsibility falls on Adam for this, but not sole because the woman has her own free will. She made her own free choices. Primary responsibility means that God calls Adam to account first in 3:9. He's the greatest human authority. Therefore, he's the most responsible for the situation of rebellion amongst humanity. He could have put a stop to it. Even if we'll talk about this in just a second, even if he's not right there with Eve when she's talking to the serpent, and that's an open debate, is he standing right there or not? Even if he's not, he should know what this fruit she's offering him is. He's not stupid. And he should know that even if, he is stupid, but, even if she's done it, he should know he's not supposed to. And he does know. That's the point. He knows. Just as we all know what we're not supposed to do, We all know what right and wrong is, but we convince ourselves that it's right in our own eyes. And because of that, we get it wrong, and we need to be held responsible. Well, Adam gets the climax of the judgment. Adam gets the longest judgment. He gets the harshest judgment. He gets called to account first because he's the one most responsible. But he's not the only one responsible. In the Bible, authority really means responsibility. It's not power to dominate. Adam, the original king, priest, and prophet, is commissioned directly by God. So the woman's authority as queen, priestess, and prophetess derives from Adam because she's taken out of man. That's what her entire name, woman, means. Her entire purpose comes out of the man's purpose. They're sharing one life in marriage. That's what marriage is. You're not sharing, you're not in possession of two lives. You're sharing a single life. Here, this is what they're supposed to be doing, sharing a single life and a single purpose. But the woman's purpose and responsibility, authority, and power derives from his. Because he's made first, his authority, meaning his responsibility, supersedes hers in ways that is not fully reciprocal. There's a reason God doesn't curse anything when he talks to the woman. He doesn't even use the word. There's a reason that when he institutes physical death, he goes to the head of humanity, not the second in command of humanity. Now, because his authority supersedes hers, his judgment also supersedes hers. That's why his is the strongest, the worst, the most brutal. His authority over his wife as her head means that he is responsible for whatever good or bad happens to her, as far as free will goes anyways. She's a free creature. She can make her own decisions. If she goes off and does wrong, he's still supposed to be responsible for sticking around God and doing right. But they're in this together now. So it is primarily Adam's fault, but it is not solely Adam's fault. This is why Paul, in describing Adam in Romans 5, 1 Corinthians, I forget where, is it 15? I don't remember what chapter in Corinthians it is. This is why Paul puts the emphasis on saying it's all Adam's fault, and he doesn't even mention Eve. We're told these details so that we can understand our first father and our first mother set up a pattern. We're all replicating the pattern somehow. This is how that works, why they're archetypes. But the same pattern holds true for husbands as head of their households. Whatever they do or don't do affects everything else underneath them. And if they do good, it will actually benefit everybody else underneath them. But if they do bad, it will also rip apart everything else underneath. But it's also possible, because woman is a free creature, that man can actually do right and she cannot. It's also possible that woman can do right in the face of her husband doing wrong. In biblical times, largely because women had no legal standing to initiate their own divorce, and so men just did it by. Yeah, the discussion with the rabbis of Jesus' day is basically between, can we divorce our wife for any reason, or does the reason actually have to be adultery? And Jesus basically comes down on the side of saying you actually have to have the reason. God made two one, so don't tear them apart. Just because the rabbis got so ridiculous during Jesus' day, they said if you burned your man's soup, he can legally divorce you. That was a legitimate discussion point among the Jewish rabbis of Jesus' day. My wife didn't cook my food right. I'm going to divorce her and move on. And Jesus says, nope, that's terrible. That is not what God wants, and you have no right to do that. Why does he allow divorce? Because of the hardness of your hearts. Because there are some things that break the marriage covenant so deeply that you've killed it even if you're not legally done. And he says, in those situations, and adultery is the prime example, that is acceptable to God. It's not ideal, but he allows for it. But Jesus and the rabbis are not speaking exhaustively about all things. They're speaking about a very specific rabbinic issue. So when Paul comes along like 30 years later and he's writing 1 Corinthians and he says, look, if a married couple of unbelievers one of them suddenly becomes a believer, you should try and stick with that marriage. However, I understand that it's going to be really hard for a non-believer to want to stay married to a believer. And he says, if that's the case, if your non-believing spouse wants to leave you, you just kind of have to be okay with it, and you're going to let them go, right? Because Jesus, the rabbis, they're not speaking exhaustively about all situations. He's just making a point to saying you do have to have a reason to get divorced, but there are more legitimate reasons than simply what they talk about in those passages. I would never tell a woman who's being abused by her husband, well, you can't divorce him because he hasn't cheated on you. No, get out, because he's broken your covenant. He's broken your marriage. You don't need to stay in that. So, okay, 1, 2, 3. I got 6 or 7 slides here. Let me see if I can get through them. There's not a lot on each of these. So, authority in the Bible is supposed to be used by anyone in possession of it, and because we're all image bearers, we all have authority of some kind. But we're all supposed to use it in love, not selfishness, not tyranny, but willing the good of others, which is a phrase attributed to St. Thomas Aquinas. Willing the good of others is the Catholic definition of love, and it's a pretty good definition of love. And that's how you're going to actually fulfill your responsibilities towards them. Will their good, serve their needs, and do for them what you want to see done is the golden rule, primarily applies to marriage. So, now I want to come back to this question about was Adam next to his wife when these things are happening. So, it determines how you have to read a couple of phrases. The way Adam failed might actually depend on where he was in relation to Eve. In Genesis 6, it says, she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. Does that mean that Adam was standing right there the whole time the serpent was speaking to the woman? And my point is, it doesn't have to be that specific. It just doesn't. Who was with her in the garden could just merely be a phrase of identification for saying, look, they both live in the garden together, and this is what the language is describing. They share the space of the garden. It's not necessarily that they're both standing there at the tree, all right? If you listen, verse 17 says, because you listen to the voice of your wife, doesn't mean that, it seems to indicate that the serpent wasn't there and he's not listening to the voice of the serpent. God doesn't repeat the words in 2:15 through 17 to the woman, and the serpent's tempting words are not repeated to the man. It seems to indicate that the man wasn't there when this conversation was going on. I think that's probably a better option, but I don't know that. I'm just throwing that out there because, look, if Adam was right next to his wife when the serpent was present, and let's say that that's a viable option because I think, okay, I can't prove that it's not, so I have to at least consider the question. If that's the case, then his major failure comes through omission, meaning he didn't do something. He let the whole thing happen. He abdicated his priestly responsibilities. He didn't intervene to stop it. As the head of humanity and as the king, his authority supersedes the queen. And if the queen wants to reach out and take that fruit, the king is supposed to step up and say, nope, because the high king God said no. And if he's standing right there while this is going on, he's not doing that. He sits back. He doesn't do anything to stop the serpent. He doesn't rebuke the serpent for his lies. He doesn't correct the serpent. He doesn't correct his wife. And he doesn't stop her from reaching out and taking the fruit. So this would be a failure by passivity, not active responsibility. Now, this is generally how from pulpits you're going to hear the story gets taught. That Adam was there the whole time, that he didn't do anything. Because men now are actually very passive, and they kind of read that back into the passage and say, this is why men are so passive and don't fulfill their responsibility. Which may be true, but that's not what the story is really saying. Because there's also a pattern of leadership post-sin that's not good, but maybe also one that is good. Adam led his wife in the wrong direction after they rebelled. He led in making clothes for covering their nakedness, from hiding from God when they heard him coming. He led in blaming his wife instead of owning up to his own guilt. He takes initiative after the fall. It's just in all the wrong ways. But maybe, just maybe, he also takes the lead in believing God's promises, because Adam Eve, the serpent, they all seem to be present when God is there judging. Maybe the serpent's not present, but we don't know, because if Eve had to leave and find her husband somewhere else in the garden, feed it to her, and then God shows up, the serpent may not be around when God is explicitly cursing them. And he's just saying, cursed is the serpent, because Eve said, well, he deceived me. He says, fine, cursed is the serpent. He doesn't need the serpent there to be him. But in verse 20, it says, Adam named his wife Eve because she would be the mother of all the living. By naming the woman Eve, the Hebrew word for woman is Isha. The Hebrew word for man is Ish. Isha. Man, woman. Eve, the Hebrew word is Hava, means living, life, because she would be the mother of all the living. I would suggest, and I'm not the first one to suggest it, that he's believing God's words in verse 15, that the seed would come and that ultimately humanity would be victorious over the serpent. He seems to actually exercise some faith in God's gracious promises, even in the midst of judgment. And he expresses that by saying, you need a new name, one that's actually going to trust God's promises here. So I'll call you Life, because God says you're going to be the mother of all the living. And he wouldn't do that if he didn't hear it and believe it. So as much as Adam screws up, he seems to also be the first person, at least as far as the story is concerned, who took God at his word and believed the promises of God to save humanity. So, as much as we might want to ask him one day, how come you did this and screwed it all up for the rest of us, we might also want to thank him one day and saying, at least despite what you did and we all replicated, you also taught us how to actually trust God's gracious promises in the midst of our pain and our judgment.